Hi everyone, this is Karen from the Historical Society of Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. In this month's video, we're going to be talking about a string of murders that hit Norristown in the 1960s. From 1961 to 1966, there were 5 murders that had gone unsolved in the Norristown area. Katherine and Joseph Liceta were the first to be killed in their Norristown home, which was located at the 200 block of East 40th Street near Green Street. A few years later, in 1963, Anthony Scoma was killed in his home at 641 East Germantown Pike in Plymouth Valley. In April of 1966, Ottavio and Pauline Perricone were murdered in their home in Norristown, located at 1527 Arch Street. These murders had left the Italian-American community of Norristown quite frightened because all of the victims were killed in their own home and they were all of Italian-American heritage. 3 days after the last murder of the Perricones, an arrest was finally made. John Bruno was arrested on April 26, 1966, and he was charged for all 5 of these murders. He was 28 at the time of his arrest, and he had been living at 655 East Marshall Street in Norristown. He had been a suspect for a while, and he had actually been interviewed after Anthony Scoma's murder in 1963, and he even had voluntarily taken a lie detector test at that time. There was not enough information and evidence at that point to arrest him, so it wasn't until he had murdered the Perricones that an arrest was finally made. Bruno had had a history of mental illness. When he was with the Army for a short time, he was actually hospitalized in a Denver Army hospital, and he was later discharged, deeming unfit to serve due to his mental condition. When the police looked at his house, they did uncover the murder weapon, as well as the list of 7 names. 5 of the names were the 5 victims that Bruno had murdered over the last 4.5 years. Due to his unfortunate mental illness, Bruno was under the belief that these people had cast a curse or the evil eye on his family, and were the reason why he and his family had gone through a string of bad luck over the last few years. And it was believed that in Bruno's eyes, that if he got rid of these people, the curse would be lifted. After his arrest, a sanity commission was met, and they ultimately deemed him not competent enough to stand trial. So he was actually sent to Farview Hospital, which was a former mental hospital that has since closed. It closed in 1995. By November of 1973, Bruno was stated to be now competent enough to stand trial. And they ultimately decided to try him on 2 counts of murders because they had enough evidence with the Perricone case to prosecute him for those murders. During the trial, the defendant's lawyer did bring up several issues with the whole process. And ultimately, prior to his final conviction, there were cases like this brought up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And to talk about what went on during the trial, including the trial that went up to the Supreme Court, We thankfully were able to interview Judge Nicholas, who was serving on the prosecution side during this case.
My involvement, oddly enough, came very, very early. I was a young associate in the private law firm of the man who was the district attorney at the time, Richard S. Lau. My involvement came when the Miranda decision came down. Bruno was arrested in April of 1966. The Miranda decision came down in June of 1966. And that was a case, of course, that mandated that prior to any custodial interrogation, the accused had to be informed of his rights, so forth. And it applied not prospectively, but to all cases that was in the judicial pipeline. So in any case that was not yet tried, even though Bruno was charged, it applied to his case. Well, it was a firestorm. I remember Dick Lau coming back to the office and said, "Bill, you got to research this case and tell me if it's applicable." So I read the books, and after reading it, I said, "Yes, it is. You can't use a confession because he was not advised of his rights." So that figures in the history of the case as we move along. But that was my first involvement as a very young associate, a couple of years out of law school in Dick Lau's private office. And then, of course, later, and many years later, I joined the DA's office in 1968 as an assistant. Milton Moss was the district attorney at the time. And we appeared in 1970 in the U.S. Supreme Court. So we appeared in December of 1970 to argue the case. It became clear from the argument that the case really did not present the facts that I think the court thought it was presenting. And after the argument, I told Milton Moss, "Milton, I think we're going to get an order that the case is dismissed, that the writ of certiorari was improvidently granted." Months later, January 12, 1971, comes the order. Case dismissed, writ of certiorari improvidently granted. The case presented many, many fascinating legal issues which had not yet been resolved at that point. That's why I think the court took the case. The interplay between the accused's right to a fair trial versus a speedy trial. District Attorney Lau at the time petitioned for a sanity commission because it was clear that Bruno was mentally ill and probably incompetent to stand trial. Due process requires that before an accused person can be tried, he's got to be competent. He or she has to be competent. That means you have to understand the nature of the charges. You have to be able to cooperate with your lawyer. And if a person doesn't have that capacity and is incompetent to proceed, it would be a denial of due process to force such a person to trial. So that's one right on this side. The other side is an accused has the right to a speedy trial. So you have two rights of the accused person that appear to be in conflict, or at least in a degree of tension between those rights. So Bruno's lawyer, Daniel Quinlan, who had been a judge here in Montgomery County, he argued that Bruno's right to a speedy trial trumped everything. And because the confession was really not admissible in the criminal case, he took the position that the Commonwealth really was not able to successfully prosecute Bruno. And therefore, this whole idea of a sanity commission was a subterfuge just to have him locked up. There was ample circumstantial evidence to convict Bruno. We had the murder weapon found in his apartment. We had a slash mark on his cheek. Mr. Perricone, the decedent, slashed him with a sword cane after he entered the house before he was shot and killed. So we had, after he was arrested, that slash mark on his cheek. We had the list of 7 names of people he was intent on murdering because he felt they had placed an evil eye on his family. Quinlan argued that we couldn't prosecute the case. We didn't have enough evidence, and this was all a subterfuge. Now, when the Sanity Commission procedure was appealed and the commission found that he was incapacitated and reported that to the court. Judge Honeyman entered an order committing him to Farview State Hospital. Bruno had been found competent to proceed, so we had to bring him to trial, in the DA's office. He was tried before Judge Honeyman and convicted. That conviction was overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court because the confession had been suppressed. But there was a lot of publicity about the fact that it was suppressed. Courtrooms are open, so the press reported the suppression proceedings, confession is out, all over the papers. The Supreme Court said that Judge Honeyman had not taken enough precaution to insulate the jury against the possibility that they were exposed to the fact that there was a confession that could not be used, new trial granted. Well, that grant of a new trial came down like a month after I became DA in 1976. So now here we go, we have to try him again. The case was tried in 1976 before Judge Davenport and a jury. And again, Bruno was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And he died in prison.
You obviously have seen many cases in your career. Is there anything in particular that makes this case stand out to you in your memory compared to all of the other cases that you've done over your years? What makes it so unique?
Well, it gripped this community in fear because the first of the murders occurred in October of 1961. The murder of Mr. and Mrs. Liceta. The next victim was Mr. Scoma. He had a list of 7 names, all elderly Italian people, who were known to John, to his family, who he believed were placing the hex or the evil eye on his family, that accounted for all of their misfortune. His father, Mr. Bruno, had been a jeweler. He'd fallen on hard times. Business was bad. The mother was in and out of the state hospital with her mental illness. So they were pretty down on their luck, tragically. And he attributed this to somebody just creating this misfortune by placing the evil eye on them. And he was bound to determine that the only way to get rid of it is to eliminate these people. It's not uncommon in many cultures to believe that people have the ability to create difficulty for other people by giving them evil eye, sometimes called the overlooks. If you give a person a real, hard stare, somehow it's felt that these people with that capacity can actually influence, in a negative way, other people's lives and fortunes. A man named William Shainline became something of a confidant of John's. He fancied himself, as I remember, as a white witch. In other words, somebody who could offset the evil eye. Somehow John latched onto him. And through their communication, Shainline became aware that the people who were being murdered were people that John was talking about. So eventually, I guess initially he thought there was some confidentiality that existed between them, but eventually, and it took the last of the murders for him to come forward, Shainline, and then that just started the ball rolling.
Ultimately, after all of the trials and retrials that had gone through, Bruno was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder in the Perricone murders because that was the most recent of the 5 murders, and the police and prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him. He was sentenced to 2 life terms at Graterford Prison, where he ultimately passed away. If you like these videos, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channels so that you can be notified when a new video is released. The Historical Society of Montgomery County is a private nonprofit museum and library located in Norristown, Pennsylvania. We rely on support from our members, volunteers, community, and viewers like you. If you would like to donate so that we can continue making these videos, you can do so by clicking the donations link in the description section below, which will take you to our main website. Thank you all so much for your support, and we look forward to seeing you in a future video.